What if I told you the world's first organized sporting events weren't created for entertainment? They were created to prepare soldiers for war, honor powerful gods, and strengthen the rule of kings. Long before championship trophies, athletes competed for something much bigger than victory. They competed for survival, faith, and sometimes even their lives. This is a story about how competition became organized sport. In the last episode, we explored the survival era when running, throwing, wrestling, climbing, and swimming weren't games, they were skills that kept our ancestors alive. But around 10,000 BCE, the world began to change. For the first time, survival wasn't humanity's only challenge. Well, sort of. These growing societies did create armies to defend their borders. Their leaders wanted to prove they deserved power. They then created rituals that would unite thousands of people under a common identity. So instead of abandoning the skills that had carried humanity to that point, they transformed them. Running went from a survival necessity to military training. Archery went from a hunting tactic to battle preparation. And wrestling was about the same, meant for being a test of strength and discipline, but competition took itself to an entirely new purpose. Entire civilizations were united under this. Across Mesopotamia, Ancient Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, Greek, and Rome, all of which we will cover today. Cultures separated by thousands of miles reached a very similar conclusion. The best way to preserve life's most important skills was to turn them into competition. That decision changed history forever because these weren't simply the birth of new games, it was the birth of organized sport. And it all began when civilizations discovered that competition could build far more than stronger athletes.
This is war! I declare war! I declare war!
All the earliest civilizations all faced the same problem. Peace never lasted forever. So no matter how advanced a kingdom became, some ruler always wanted its land, resources, or its power. Cities could build walls, kings could create laws, farmers could produce enough food to feed thousands, but none of that mattered if a civilization couldn't defend itself. Every kingdom needed warriors, and since warriors needed training, the question was simple. How do you prepare someone for the chaos of a battlefield before they even step onto it? Ancient civilizations found an answer that would shape the future of sports. They turned training into competition. These activities weren't created just to pass the time, they were created to build the physical and mental skills that soldiers needed to survive. In Mesopotamia, one of the world's first organized civilizations, physical contests became connected to strength and leadership. Relief carvings and seals show wrestlers locked in combat, demonstrating techniques that would have been valuable during close-range fighting. The ability to overpower another person mattered. Mesopotamian rulers also used physical displays to prove their authority. Assyrian kings were shown to be hunting lions, one of the most dangerous animals of the ancient world. These images were messages. A powerful ruler was capable of defeating threats, someone capable of protecting his people. The same idea appeared along the Nile River in Egypt. Egyptian tombs reveal organized wrestling match, archery tournaments, spear throwing, and boat races. These activities provided entertainment, but they also reflected the skills valued by Egyptian society. Even the pharaoh participated in ceremonial displays of strength. These events reminded people that their ruler was not only chosen to govern, but was also capable of protecting them. Thousands of miles away, ancient India developed a similar connection between athletic ability and warfare. The Kshatriyas, the warrior class of the Vedic society, trained in combat skills from a young age. They practiced archery, sword fighting, wrestling, and chariot warfare. In Indian tradition, mastery of the body was connected to mastery of the battlefield. Stories like Mahabharata preserved this idea through legendary heroes whose abilities as athletes and fighters were inseparable. China developed its own approach, but the purpose remained the same. Preparation. Archers became one of the most respected skills for their warriors to have. Competitions tested accuracy, but they also tested patience, concentration, and self-control. A person who could remain calm while aiming at a target could also remain calm when facing an enemy. In theory, anyways. Across these civilizations, competition became a new way to identify excellence. The battlefield created the need for these contests, but the contests themselves created something unexpected. Heroes. Not too dissimilar from the way that top athletes are idolized today, warriors became symbols of courage. Champions became examples for others to follow. And as more people gathered to watch these competitions, something began to change. The purpose of sport was expanding. It was no longer about preparing for war, it was about becoming a way for different societies to celebrate shared values. And soon competition will move from the training grounds of warriors into the sacred spaces of gods.
What better way to show respect to the gods than by throwing a javelin as far as humanly possible?
Okay, so before we begin this section, keep your personal religious beliefs to yourself. This ain't about you. This is about the cultures that I am going to discuss and what they believed in. Cool? Cool. Okay, back to the script. For thousands of years, competition had one clear purpose: prepare people for conflict. But as societies grew, something changed. People began asking a different question. What if competition could do more than create warriors? What if it could bring people closer to the gods? Across the ancient world, sports became connected to religion. Athletes were no longer competing only against each other. They were competing as a way to honor higher powers, celebrate creation, and prove that humans could achieve greatness. Nowhere was this idea more famous than in ancient Greece. Every 4 years, athletes from all across the Greek world gathered at Olympia for a festival unlike anything people had seen before. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it was known as the Olympic Games. But they were made for more than entertainment. They were a religious celebration dedicated to Zeus, the king of all Greek gods. Athletes arrived knowing the stakes were bigger than personal victory. Before competing, they took sacred oaths promising to follow the rules. Winning brought incredible honor not just to the athlete but to their entire city-state. A champion did not return home as a skilled competitor. They returned as a symbol of their community's greatness. The earliest Olympic event was a foot race, but over time the games expanded to things like wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, and chariot racing. Each event reflected the qualities the Greeks admired. They believed competition revealed the best qualities of humanity. The Olympics weren't the only sacred athletic tradition in the ancient world. In China, competition was closely connected to ceremony and personal discipline. We'll use archery as the example here again. Contests were not simply about hitting a target, they were designed to test character. The competition itself became a lesson in morality. The goal wasn't just victory, it was about becoming a better person through the process. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away again, Mesopotamian societies developed one of the most unique examples of a sacred sport in human history, the rubber ball game. Think racquetball minus the rackets and with a 9-pound ball. I had visual aids to help us out because even I didn't know what this was before we started. Beginning thousands of years ago, communities across Mesoamerica built massive stone ball courts at the center of the cities. They weren't hidden practice areas, they were public spaces where athletic competition, religion, and politics collide. The game carried deep spiritual meaning. Ancient traditions connected the contests to stories about creation, life, and death. The struggle between opposing teams represented larger battles happening within a universe itself. For some societies, the outcome of these games could determine honor, status, and even life or death. Suddenly losing your parlay seems a little less important now, doesn't it? The ball game showed just how powerful sports had become. It wasn't just something people watched, it represented the beliefs of an entire civilization. Egypt followed a similar path. Pharaohs used athletic displays during religious festivals and royal ceremonies to determine whether strength, renewal, and divine approval were needed to be demonstrated. Physical ability became part of the ruler's relationship to their people and the gods they worshiped. Across continents, the details were different, but the general idea was the same. Competition had become a bridge between humanity and something greater. People weren't gathering only to see who was the strongest or the fastest, they were gathering to celebrate what they believed that they were and who they believed that they were. I could argue that we still do this to this very day. And once these sacred competitions began attracting massive crowds, rulers discovered something even more powerful. Sports could unite entire societies. It could create identities. It could bring rivals together. And it could become one of the greatest public spectacles the world has ever seen.
Let the games begin.
A competition can bring people together, but without structure, it just remains a contest. As ancient sporting events grew larger, ancient civilizations faced a new challenge. How do you make sure a competition is fair? How do you decide who wins? How do you control thousands of people gathered to watch? The answer was a very simple invention that every modern sport also depends on: rules. Across the ancient world, society began developing systems that transformed physical contests into organized events. In Greece, the Olympics became one of the clearest examples of this evolution. Athletes didn't just arrive to Olympia and start competing. There were procedures, there were officials, and there were expectations. Competitors took oaths before participating, promising to follow the rules of the game. Judges monitored events and had the authority to punish athletes who cheated or violated Olympic traditions. The goal was simple. Victory only mattered if it was earned. The idea might seem obvious today to most of us, but the ancient world, it represented a major change. Competition was no longer just about having the strongest person win. It was about creating a shared standard that everyone agreed to follow. Other civilizations developed their own systems. In China, again, we're going to go back to archery, their competitions followed strict traditions that emphasized order and discipline. In Rome, organized sport became even larger. Roman officials known as editors were responsible for arranging public games, hiring performers, managing schedules, and making sure events run smoothly. Sport had become a massive operation, and massive operations require permanent spaces. The rise of organized sport changed the way that civilizations built their cities. In Greece, stadiums and gymnasiums became dedicated locations for athletic training and competition. The stadium at Olympia provided a permanent home for the Olympic foot races and could hold thousands of spectators. Athletes trained in facilities designed specifically for improving physical performance. Competition finally had a home. In Mesoamerica, cities built enormous stone ball courts that became the central part of public life. They weren't temporary fields created for a single event. They were permanent structures that showed how important the ball game had become. In Rome, the scale grew even larger. The Circus Maximus became one of the greatest sporting venues the ancient world has ever seen, and I'd argue still seen to this very day. Hundreds of thousands of spectators could gather to watch chariot races. The Colosseum transformed combat into massive public events. See the movie The Gladiator, for example. The Romans understood something that modern sports still rely on today. A great competition requires a great stage. The growth of organized sport also changed what athletes could gain from competing. At the Olympics, winners received Olympic wreaths rather than large financial prizes. But the rewards didn't end there. Champions returned home as heroes. Cities celebrated them. Some did receive money, special privileges, and lifetime honors, but their victories were more about becoming part of their community's history. In Rome, successful competitors could become famous throughout the empire. Charioteers gained loyal fans, gladiators became celebrities, and some athletes even turned competition into a career. For the first time, sports began developing many of the features we recognize today. The foundation of modern sports was being built thousands of years before television, professional league, or championship trophies ever existed. But as competition became more organized, another transformation took place. Sports stopped only being about the people who were competing. They became about everyone watching. They became a reflection of society itself, and in the ancient world, the biggest competitions weren't just games, they were displays of power, identity, and prestige.
It's a secret society. All we ask is strive. All we got is us.
Once sports became organized, something unexpected happened. They became bigger than the athletes competing. They became part of society itself. People didn't just participate in these events, they built their identities around them. They traveled across regions to watch. They celebrated champions, they argued over winners and losers. Thousands of years before First Take, modern fans who wore jerseys or filled stadiums, ancient civilizations had already discovered the emotional power of sports. In Greece, athletic champions became symbols of pride for their entire city. An Olympic victory was not just a personal achievement, it was a statement about where you were from. The athlete represented more than themselves, they represented their people. Their connection between sports and identity continued in Rome, but with a different purpose. Roman leaders understood that public entertainment could influence public opinion. Emperors and politicians funded massive games because they knew successful events would create loyalty and strengthen their reputation. The phrase bread and circuses would later describe Rome's approach to keeping citizens entertained and connected to the state. Sports had become a political tool. The largest examples came from Roman chariot races and gladiatorial combat. At the Circus Maximus, fans supported different racing teams with intense loyalty. The competition wasn't just between the drivers, it was between communities of supporters. Crowds celebrated victories, mourned defeats, and sometimes became involved in conflict over their favorite team. So the emotions that surround modern sports were already familiar. But ancient sports were not open to everybody. Participation often reflected the structure of society itself. Most formal competitions were dominated by men, especially those with social status or military connection. In Greece, Olympic athletes were male citizens. Women were largely excluded from the main events, although there was separate traditions existed such as the Heraean Games, which were honoring the goddess Hera. In China, going back to archery, their ritualistic competitions were strongly connected to male education and leadership. Across many civilizations, athletic competition reflected the role society had created. Class also shaped who could compete. Elite warriors and nobles often had access to the best training equipment and opportunities. Horse racing and charity events required wealth and resources. Military sports were often connected to warrior classes, but sports also created unusual opportunities for people outside of the traditional elite. In Rome, some of the most famous competitors came from lower social classes. Charioteers were often slaves or freed men. Gladiators were frequently prisoners or enslaved people. Yet through success, some became famous throughout the empire. Their skill could give them something rare, recognition, or clout in modern terms. Sports created a space where ability could sometimes change social boundaries. This is one of the most powerful ideas that were created during the ancient sporting world. A person's performance could become their legacy. Long after kingdoms disappeared, the rules forgotten, people still remembered their champions. Their names survived because they achieved something that mattered to their communities. They became proof that humans could push beyond ordinary limits. The ancient world had created nearly every major ingredient that defines sports today. The games were different from the ones we watch now, but the emotions are surprisingly familiar. People still want to see greatness. They want something to cheer for. They want someone to cheer for. They want moments that could be celebrated forever. But the ancient sporting world was about to face a massive change. The empires that built their legendary competitions began to fall, and when they disappeared, sports would enter a new era, one where games would no longer belong mainly to kings, warriors, and cities. They would belong to the people.
Legacy, 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 legacy.
Thousands of years ago, humans made a discovery. Competition could be more than a test of ability. It could bring people together. It can create heroes. It could represent the values of an entire civilization. This discovery changed sports forever. The ritual and warrior era transformed simple physical contests into something much larger. Running was no longer just a way to chase prey or deliver messages. It was a race for honor. Wrestling was no longer only a survival skill. It became a demonstration of strength and discipline. Throwing became competition. Combat became sport. Games became tradition. The moment humanity created the foundation of organized sports, the ancient world gave sports many of the ideas that we still recognize today. Athletes still take oaths of sorts before competing. Champions still represent more than themselves. Stadiums are still gathering places where communities celebrate shared identity. Nations still use sporting events to display pride. The details have changed, the equipment is different, the rules have evolved, but the purpose remains about the same. People still want to see what humans are capable of achieving. But perhaps the greatest legacy of this era is not just the creation of specific sports. It is the idea that competition can tell a story. Every race has a challenge, every match has a conflict, every champion has a journey. The ancient Greeks understood this. The Romans understood this. The Mesopotamians understood this. And there would have been many references to African nations here, but European colonization made sure there was very literal, verifiable evidence for me to go off of to make this video. But the civilizations I could get info on who created these early games understood something about human nature. We are drawn to moments where someone pushes beyond their limits, when preparation meets pressure, when a person has the chance to become something greater than they are. By 500 CE, organized sports had begun to take shape, but the history was about to change. The great empires that built massive arenas, sacred festivals began to decline. Cities fell. Political systems collapsed. Many of the famous competitions of the ancient world disappeared, but the desire to compete never did. The games move away from imperial stadiums into villages, towns, and communities across the world. And that's the next era of sports that will not be defined by kings or empire. It will be shaped by ordinary people, local tradition, cultural identity, and games passed down from one generation to the next. When the history of sports is not just the history of competition, it becomes the history of humanity. It is the sport of how the skills that once kept us alive became the games that brought us together. And the next chapter begins when sports left great arenas of the ancient world and became the traditions of everyday people. This is the beginning of the folk and nation era, and that'll be next episode. Thank you for watching.